Let us begin with this research question. How does race influence our culture, especially with respect to class, within our social climate? Before we begin to answer the question of how race influences our culture, especially with respect to class, we must first determine and define what race is in a modern context. One definition of race comes from the Oxford American Dictionary, each of the major divisions of humankind having distinct physical characteristics. Another definition from the same source is this: a group of people sharing the same culture, history, language, etc., an ethnic group. It is clear to see from both definitions that race has strong associations with categorizing people, groups, based off their characteristics that make them unique from other groups. This distinction will provide a great platform on our discussion about the influence of race in our culture. Race is a very important issue because it has played a very important role as a part of our history as a nation. One of the biggest problems with race is one of the fruits that it produces: racism. The Oxford American Dictionary states that racism is defined as the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. In her article, Tatum describes an interaction with the student, where the student asks the author whether or not racism still exists in our society. Obviously, racism does still exist, but we must find out where and why. Tatum argues that racism begins early on in a child's life within the United States. She states that many of her students live in segregated neighborhoods that, in essence, promote the division and stratification of different racial groups in America. To add more evidence to the presence of racial stratification in our society, Tatum describes that for white people, there are systematic advantages in our society which include life expectancy and salary. The implications of race have taken root in the youth of our nation. Anagnostopoulos et al. Documented in a recent study that there is a new racism that is arising in the youth of the U.S. This new form of racism looks quite different from the typical form of racism that we often are knowledgeable about in our society. They stated that the white American youth reject affirmative action policies that are intended to address racial inequality, since the policies undermine the American values of individualism and meritocracy. They note that this leads to the white youth to construct positive self-representations of being non-racist. Of course, this is while they retain negative stereotypes of other races as being intellectually inferior. It is quite clear to see that the problems with race in our culture are often covered up or hidden from the consciousness of the American people. In a lecture by Silva, he points out, most people, whites, claim that race is no longer a relevant social factor and that racists are a species at the brink of extinction. He clearly dismisses this notion later by saying that blacks, in particular, are poor, earn less, and are significantly less wealthy than whites. He goes on to say that a new ideology that describes modern racial inequality is colorblind racism. This new form of racism is fueled by those who make presumptions about racial groups, who act reasonably with their individualism, and justify inequalities by stating that things are just the way they are. In her article, Froyum investigated a study where an employer used the concept of professionalism in order to promote colorblindness and muted criticism during work conflicts. Whenever conflicts arose in the workplace between different racial groups, they were settled in a way that was calculated and fabricated in order to subordinate the African American workers to their white co-workers. Froyum lastly summarizes that professionalism legitimizes the subordination of black employees by framing their emotional deference as necessary to the work. The presence of race within our society is certainly felt within the realm of the media. In his article, Huey explores the issue of race within web-based news companies. He challenges that the web is not a free utopia that forgets all the social distinctions that we have been brought up with in our culture. He notes that race and racism continue to exist in web-based media in ways that are both unique and similar to the way that race has been depicted in the past. In particular, he explored the cases where people would leave racist comments regarding some type of article or story. In an attempt to restrict the public from seeing the racist comments, organizations have severely increased their comment monitoring and control systems. In reality, this continues to promote the idea of colorblind racism in our culture, since the racism is hidden from the public eye. Yet racism and the effects of racial distinctions are still heavily intertwined in our culture. In her article, Sethi argues that race and class are intimately related. She states that for Asian Americans, race discrimination has been carried out because of class competition with other racial groups within the United States. In an article, Mancios explains that the class structure in the United States is a function of its capitalist economic system. He later states that one of the realities that we all must face is that racism and sexism have significantly compounded the effects of class in our society. Within his article, he gives a table that describes the chances of being poor in America based off gender and race. This shows us that whites are anywhere from 3 to 4 times less likely to be poor than other racial groups. What this ultimately means is that those who are underprivileged in our society, that being females, people of color, etc., often do not have class mobility, which continues to promote incisive division within our country. In her article, Brewer notes that black workers have felt the sting of economic dispossession because of racism's effect of historically mediating and shaping class inequality. She argues that our current economy requires fewer black people in order to operate on a daily basis. This statement is backed by the 2012 statistic that shows unemployment among blacks at 14%, while the national U.S. unemployment rate is 7.8%. She then concludes that the 500-year economic underdevelopment of blacks is one of the leading contributors to the reason why there is such disparity between races in our capitalist economy. Downward movement of African Americans in the U.S. was discussed by Wilson et al. They stated that African Americans are no longer protected from downward movement within our economy. This means that although blacks may enjoy a privileged background status, accumulate significant capital, or a prestigious job title, they are still very subject to downward movement. Wilson et al. Also described how, compared to other racial groups, African Americans experience this downward shift in class or economic status earlier in their careers, which causes them to enjoy their high-level positions for less time. They argue that this propensity to have downward mobility can cause blacks to have a more difficult time fending off home foreclosures. Additionally, they state that home ownership is one of the largest portions of net worth for blacks, which makes this issue even more paramount. Muhammad reveals some statistics that shed much light on the racial inequalities that exist in America. He shows that the black home ownership rate is 47%, the Latino rate is 49.7%, and the white rate is 75%. The home ownership rate is nearly double that for whites. Another staggering statistic is that white families have $140,700 median net worth, while African Americans have $20,600, and Latino families have $18,600. What is interesting about these statistics is that they often are a function of history, not of the present time. Simply put, the racial disparities have a greater relationship with major events that have occurred in history prior to our current time. In his article, Taylor notes that for African Americans specifically, their exclusion from traditional and conventional credit sources forcibly sent them into exploitative and predatory relationships with meticulous lenders in the 1960s. Also noteworthy is the fact that African Americans were paying extra sums of money for the housing that was inferior to whites. Taylor states that this phenomenon was given the description of the race tax. He reveals that residential segregation as well as unequal lending opportunities have led to the difference that we now see with the home ownership rates among different racial groups. In conclusion, it is clear to see that the categorization and division of race has played a very important role in dividing our society, especially with respect to class divisions. It is quite interesting that many people today don't believe that aspects of race, those being racism, segregation, and prejudice, are still alive in our culture. In summary, we have examined the various ways in which race still impacts our culture and plays an important role in shaping our class system and our economy. As we move forward in our country, may we not be colorblind and ignorant about the issues at hand. I implore you to reflect on the topics that were discussed and to make a contribution towards tearing down the issue of race within our culture. Now that we've addressed the research question that was originally posed of how does race influence our culture, especially with respect to class within our social climate, I now invite you to take a couple of minutes to listen to this original song that I composed that has a lot of ties with racism and how that's affected our culture and inequality in our society. And I invite you to listen to the words and to try to really think about what is being said and to relate that to our discussion today. Thank you and enjoy. It's a race to cut separation. The cream that's rising to the top. While the rest settles down below, only to be discarded. It's sneakily hidden out of sight and mind. Oh, but it creeps its way past the man who's blind, that I can see, the heart can feel. Can we stop the bleeding? Why must a man be denied from those which give him joy? Oh, does a blind man know the difference? That you speak of my boy, to be turned away time and again, from help, from love, from everything. Oh, will we ever find the answer? Till then we'll sing na 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 na.